On April 5, 1942, Hitler sanctioned the blueprint for Operation Blue, designating the acquisition of Baku's oil reserves and the North Caucasus as the paramount objective for the Wehrmacht summer campaign. During a strategic meeting with the commanders of Army Group South, the Führer declared, "If I don't secure the oil from Maykop and Grozny, I will be forced to conclude this war." The decision to strike towards the Caucasus was made by Hitler as early as November of 41, even before the commencement of the Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow. The outcome of the war hinged on the struggle for these vital resources. Germany's fuel balance was short by approximately 1 million tons of oil annually. Germany not only hoped to secure its own supplementary fuel sources, but also to deprive the Soviet Union of its crucial Caucasian oil fields. By the outbreak of war, the oil fields of Baku accounted for over 70% of the total oil extraction. Furthermore, during the years of industrialization, rich deposits of mineral resources were discovered in the Caucasus. This region supplied the country with 65% of its natural gas and more than 50% of its manganese ore. The capture of the Caucasian oil fields would have dealt a severe blow to the combat readiness of the Red Army, leaving tanks and vehicles stranded with empty fuel tanks. In July of 1942, after a prolonged siege, German and Romanian forces seized Sevastopol and occupied the entirety of Crimea. Shortly thereafter, Hitler divided Army Group South into two formidable formations. One, Army Group Blauen, was tasked with capturing Stalingrad and severing Soviet supply lines along the Volga River. The other, Army Group A, was ordered to penetrate the Caucasus Mountains and take Baku. The operation was given the codename Edelweiss. The German High Command intended to bypass the main Caucasian mountain range and encircle Soviet forces with two devastating blows from the west and the east. Approximately 170,000 soldiers and officers, over 1,100 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft were deployed for the offensive into the Caucasus. The operation was led by Field Marshal Wilhelm List, a seasoned German commander who had participated in all major Wehrmacht campaigns since the beginning of the Second World War. The Caucasus was defended by two Soviet fronts: the North Caucasian Front under Marshal Semyon Budyonny and the Transcaucasian Front under General Ivan Tyelnev. However, they possessed insufficient forces for this task. Reserves that could have reinforced troops in the most critical sectors of the front were not dispatched by Stavka. The initial German assault was launched near Voronezh on June 28, 42, leading to a collapse of Soviet defenses. German armored divisions reached the Don River near the village of Nikolovskaya and constructed a pontoon bridge capable of supporting tanks. German war machines, one after another, crossed the frontier between Europe and Asia. The Wehrmacht had never advanced this far before. For a time, the advancing German tanks under General Mackensen were halted at the Manik River. Here, a dam of a reservoir was blown. However, the destruction of bridges and dams could only delay, not halt, the advance of German tanks towards the foothills of the Caucasus. On July 23, 42, after fierce street fighting, German troops captured Rostov-on-Don. 2 days later, the Wehrmacht received the order to commence Operation Edelweiss. The main thrust was directed towards Grozny, with two tank armies committed to the offensive. On July 28th, Order number 227, "Not a Step Back," signed by Stalin, was issued. The opening lines of the document highlighted the immediate threat. Occupants could seize Kuban and the North Caucasus with their oil and grain wealth. Stalin addressed his soldiers with poignant words: though an immediate effect from the order was not expected. Military expediency remained a paramount consideration. On the day the order was issued, Stalin approved a proposal by the commander of the North Caucasian Front, Marshal Budiani, to withdraw to the line of the Terek River and the main Caucasian mountain range. These natural barriers provided a solid defensive position. The enemy was thus presented with unwelcome surprises. On August 3rd, German tanks approached Armavir. They sped across a bridge spanning the Kuban River, but then an explosion resounded, and a section of the bridge collapsed into the river. Instead of a swift capture of Armavir, fierce battles erupted at the city's outskirts. Only 2 days later did the Germans erect a tank bridge directly over the collapsed section. The armored vehicles pushed onward, but at the last moment, near the village of Labinskaya, bridges over the Laba River were blown up. German tanks were again forced to halt. The construction of bridges fell to the motorized infantry. Only light advanced detachments proceeded towards Maykop. For the push to Maykop, the German command had prepared a surprise. A sabotage detachment from the Brandenburg 800 Regiment, traveling in captured trucks over Soviet bodies, advanced towards the city. At the opportune moment, on the night of August 8th to 9th, Maykop's defenses were disrupted. The guards at the bridge over the Belia River were eliminated by saboteurs. The communications hub was seized and retreat orders were disseminated. Soon, tanks bearing crosses stormed into Maykop. At this juncture, the German command made a critical error. The task of capturing the oil fields was considered accomplished, and the advance forward slowed. This provided Soviet specialists with precious days. By the time German motorized units reached the Maykop oil fields, they were already aflame, engulfing the sky in thick black smoke. All wells were securely disabled, and the equipment evacuated. Any extraction of black gold for the Third Reich was rendered impossible. The German command's second mistake was refusing to strike immediately towards Tuapse, despite the challenging terrain. The commander of the 3rd Motorized Corps, General Mackensen, later wrote, "Motorized units in the difficult, fox-infested mountains advanced very slowly." A breakthrough by the Germans to Tuapse could have led to the collapse of the entire Soviet grouping on the Black Sea coast. The Soviet command lost no time and hastily reinforced the Tuapse region. However, contrary to the assumptions of the Soviet Stavka Army Group, a Commander Marshal Wilhelm List unexpectedly refused to continue the offensive towards Tuapse. According to a new plan, mountain jägers were ordered to break through the North Caucasus Mountains, capture the city of Sukhumi, and encircle the entire Black Sea grouping of Soviet forces. For the operation in the mountains, 2 divisions of the 49th Mountain Corps under General Rudolf Conrad were assigned. They were comprised of individuals from the southern mountainous regions of Germany and Austria and possessed specialized training. At altitudes exceeding 3,000 meters, the mountain slopes were perpetually covered in snow and ice. The Soviet command considered the mountain range an impassable barrier and paid little attention to its defense. Hastily assembled rifle units were thrown into the mountains against the Germans. Half of the soldiers lacked specialized equipment and warm clothing. The first engagements in the mountainous areas occurred on August 15, 1942. Soviet units occupied defensive positions below. German mountain jägers easily outflanked these obstacles by traversing the high mountain terrain. The first casualty was the defense of the Klokorsky Pass, which the Germans easily overcame, and they advanced toward Sukhumi. On August 21st, a group of German jägers under the command of Captain Heinz Grad, who had visited the area twice before the war, planted the flags of the Third Reich on Mount Elbrus, Europe's highest peak, under the watchful eyes of photo and newsreel reporters. The propaganda stunt on Elbrus and the very fact of the German penetration of the southern slopes of the main Caucasian ridge provoked an extremely negative reaction from the Soviet command. General Tyelnev received an urgent directive from Stalin. Those commanders who believe that the Caucasus mountain range itself is an impassable barrier for the enemy are deeply mistaken. Shortly thereafter, on Stalin's instructions, Lavreny Beria, the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, arrived in the Caucasus. Many commanders were dismissed from their posts at his behest. Skiers and mountaineers were urgently recalled from all fronts to the Caucasus. They formed well-equipped sabotage groups, and army resupply was organized. However, all these measures could not immediately reverse the situation at the front. Several passes had already been captured by the German 4th Mountain Division. Sukhumi was approximately 30 kilometers away. Under the new commander, General Lysolids, the troops of the 46th Army counterattacked, and the jägers' advance on some passes was halted. However, the situation appeared even more dramatic from the enemy's perspective. The plan, elegant on paper, encountered colossal difficulties in practice. Behind the German jägers who had reached the southern slopes of the passes lay 150 kilometers of mountain roads. The delivery of ammunition, fuel, and supplies was possible only by mule. Furthermore, in the latter half of August, the weather deteriorated sharply, making all movement along the mountain roads even more complicated. The breakthrough of the mountain jägers to Sukhumi became unattainable. The objective shifted to merely holding the occupied positions. The very division of the Army Group South forces became one of Hitler's most significant blunders. The two army groups, targeting the Don and Stalingrad, were supplied along a single railway line, leading to serious logistical problems that slowed the German advance and caused supply disruptions. While Kleist's 1st Panzer Army was pushing towards Mozdok, Field Marshal List directed the main effort towards capturing Novorossiysk, a major port on the Black Sea coast. On September 7th, the Germans broke through to the northern outskirts of Novorossiysk and began the assault on the city, engaging in street battles as fierce as those in Stalingrad. By September 9th, the Wehrmacht occupied a significant portion of Novorossiysk's western districts. Soviet troops retreated to the eastern shore of Seams Bay. The final defensive line ran along the walls of the Oktyabr proletary cement plants. However, the Germans could not advance beyond this line. While the German offensive stalled, the Soviet command carried out troop redeployments. Reinforced units marched along mountain roads to strategic defensive points near Novorossiysk, Tuapse, and the Terek River line. A suitable bridgehead on the Terek was captured by German infantry only on September 2nd. However, a swift breakthrough from it did not materialize. Another setback in Berlin finally exhausted patience. On September 10th, Field Marshal List was controversially relieved of command of Army Group. Hitler temporarily assumed command of the Army Group himself. In September 1942, the overall situation in the Caucasus began to gradually improve in favor of the Soviet forces. The Battle of Stalingrad demanded ever more reserves. Notably, the 3rd Romanian Army was withdrawn from Army Group A. Lacking the capacity to advance on all fronts simultaneously, the German High Command decided to launch sequential attacks, first on Tuapse and then in the Ardzanids region. The initial attack by the jägers led to a crisis in the defenses near Tuapse. In response, Stavka ordered a series of counterattacks against the German and Romanian troops. As a result of heavy fighting, the German offensive sputtered out 35 kilometers from the coast. Almost simultaneously, the German offensive began from the Terek bridgehead. On September 28th, 3 kilometers from Malgobek, near the village of Sagopshi, one of the largest frontal tank engagements of the summer-autumn campaign of 1942 on the Soviet-German front took place. Up to 120 tanks and self-propelled guns participated on both sides. The battle concluded with a Soviet victory. The SS Viking Motorized Division suffered heavy losses and was driven back to its initial positions. However, Kleist and Mackensen soon found a way out of the strategic deadlock. They decided to bypass the Soviet positions in the Elkostovsky Gate via Nalchik. Here, the weak 37th Army under General Pyotr Kozlov was defending, lacking tank units and fresh reserves. The offensive launched on October 26th led to a collapse of the defenses. Street battles raged in Nalchik, and German tanks advanced towards Ordzhonikidze. On November 2nd, the Germans broke through the defensive lines on the approaches to the city and captured the village of Giselle. Army Group Commander General von Kleist declared, "The fate of Ordzhonikidze is sealed. A direct road to Tbilisi, the capital of Transcaucasia, opens before the victorious German army." Concentrating 150 tanks in Giselle, the Germans attempted to break through to the center of Ardzenitz. But in November of 42, the Red Army had far greater capabilities than in July. Significant reserves had been accumulated. First, Mackensen's divisions were subjected to air attacks, followed by counterattack by tanks and infantry. German units sustained heavy losses and were forced to retreat. Near Giselle, the Red Army captured substantial trophies, including 140 damaged tanks and over 2,000 vehicles. In January 1943, German forces suffered a devastating defeat at Stalingrad. Hitler no longer had reserves to hold the Caucasus. Soviet troops launched an offensive along the entire front. Within a week, Mozdok, Pyatagorsk, Krasnodar, Voroshilovsk, and Armavir were liberated. Nazi flags were torn down from the summit of Elbrus. During the offensive, Soviet forces advanced 400 kilometers. However, the Germans managed to avoid encirclement and retreated to previously prepared positions along the Meuse River. Losing the ability to withdraw their troops from the Caucasus via Rostov-on-Don, the German High Command focused its main efforts on holding Kuban and the Taman Peninsula. Fierce fighting resumed in Novorossiysk. In February 1943, Soviet paratroopers landed on the western coast of Tsemes Bay. They managed to recapture a small strip of land covering 28 square kilometers, which the Marines nicknamed Malaya Zemlya, Little Land. They held this bridgehead for 225 days. Concurrently, troops of the North Caucasian Front approached the Taman Peninsula, where the Germans had established a heavily fortified defensive line, codenamed the Blue Line. Its assault lasted several months. Hitler strictly forbade any withdrawal from the Kuban bridgehead to Crimea. Only after the defeat of the Wehrmacht at the Battle of Kursk and the decisive shift of strategic initiative to the Red Army did it become evident in Berlin that the Taman grouping was doomed. On September 3rd, Hitler issued the order for troop withdrawal. Despite the gradual loading of units of the 17th German Army onto vessels, their troops offered fierce resistance. The Novorossiysk amphibious operation proceeded with extreme difficulty. The turning point in the battle for the city occurred only on September 15th, when the western and eastern groupings of the 18th Soviet Army, advancing towards each other, finally managed to link up in the city streets. Under threat of encirclement, the Wehrmacht units involved in the brutal street fighting began to hastily abandon Novorossiysk. The following day, the city was completely liberated. Developing the offensive, Soviet troops stormed Timryuk on September 27th, and by October 3rd, Taman was liberated. At 8 o'clock in the morning on October 9th, 1943, the commander of the 56th Army, General Andrei Grechko, future Minister of Defense, reported to the Military Council of the North Caucasian Front that Soviet forces had reached the shores of the Kerch Strait. On the same day, the remnants of the 17th German Army were evacuated to Crimea. The battle for the Caucasus concluded with a victory for the Red Army. The Wehrmacht's defeat in the Caucasus put an end to Hitler's strategic ambitions. Without new oil supplies, Germany could no longer conduct major offensive operations. Its allies, Turkey and Japan, definitively abandoned plans to attack the Soviet Union. In the battle for the Caucasus, over 340,000 Soviet soldiers and officers were killed or wounded. Total losses for the Third Reich and its allies exceeded 280,000 men. Less than a year later, the 17th German Army would suffer a catastrophic defeat in Crimea and near Sevastopol. Hitler's gamble in the Caucasus was decisively concluded.